It's a great pleasure and honor now to introduce Martin Lacher again. I will not say a lot. You've met him before and you know nearly everything about it. I think one important topic is that he is, since a few years, member of the scientific board of KEKS. And we had some very nice projects together on research base. And I challenged him with the words of Mike Rutter from Cincinnati from the conference last year, or no, 2 years ago now. If you don't think, you don't look. And if you don't look, you don't see. Please, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. This topic was really kind of challenging for me, and I took it from there. And I first thought, if you don't think, you shouldn't do the job, right? Obviously, if like you're not an expert in the topic, you shouldn't do the job. But if you don't think, you don't see, and we should see. And what should we look at? And this is what my talk is about. It starts very early in life when the baby is in the operation room, and what should we look at? And we should do a bronchoscopy. And this is not we must do a bronchoscopy. I think nowadays there's no reason not to do a bronchoscopy. And this is the scenario. You see the fistula is actually, it's a trifurcation, typical case. You want to know that before you start the operation. The second case is a fistula deriving from the posterior trachea. And that's a totally different scenario because the gap is not so long. And also during the operation, you know where to look for the fistula. And the third case is actually a case, the guide wire is already in the proximal fistula, and you also want to know that before you start, right? So nowadays, there's no reason not to do a bronchoscopy. There's a good team needed. This is a case I operated in China 10 years ago, and this guy is really important because this person does not only do the anesthesia, but you need somebody to do the bronchoscopy also. That's the OR report from that time, and there's only one word which I understand on that OR report, but I always keep it as a memory. What should we look at in long gap? This gapogram you need to do yourself, right? There is no way you can estimate the gap from only an X-ray or contrast study. You want to put the bronchoscope in the gastrostomy and some Hegar or even another scope in the upper pouch. And you want to know, is this really a long gap? Like the left patient was a patient who was like 3 months old already. If you would have known that at the time you put the gastrostomy, you can repair it. And you really want to know, assess the gap yourself as the surgeon, as the treating physician. These are things you want to have a look at. I like this quote because there's a lot of truth in that. And we differ also not inside the operation room. And this is, for example, a typical patient gets referred 5 vertebral bodies, and with a recommendation, the esophagus should be replaced, right? But sometimes this recommendation comes from people who only have a hammer, right? And you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but it's not, right? So there is a distinct population which needs esophageal replacement, but this is nowadays the minority, by far the minority of the type A. A lot of patients can be operated with the esophagus saved. And this was, for example, a case we did a 2-stage internal traction, Patkowski technique, and we scoped her actually yesterday after 5 dilations, and this is the anastomose. She's then ready before solid foods for further life. And this was a case which was actually had undergone maybe esophageal replacement at another place. So if you don't think, let someone else think for you, right? Nowadays there is AI. Let's ask Scholar GPT this question: esophageal atresia, are there any long-term problems after surgery, right? And the artificial intelligence gives you a little bit of information, and then there's reflux disease, dysphagia, Reti fistula, respiratory problems, dysmotility, growth and nutrition, associated anomalies, psychosocial, and anastomotic stricture, right? So if you don't think, somebody else can think for you, and these are the things you need to tackle, right, in the upcoming years. So there's always the co-pilot sitting next to you, and there's nowadays no way to forget one of these major things you need to look at. And I want to real briefly go into that. For example, reflux disease. Michaela is here. I cited your paper. In the long term, maybe even if it's primary anastomosis or secondary anastomosis, a lot of these have reflux disease. And a third of them will need anti-reflux procedure. And I don't want to go into the topic when to start PPI and when not. It's a matter of discussion, but we have to expect reflux disease. So these should be the things we look for. Dysphagia. We have a real-time MRI in Leipzig where you can have an MRI in real time and study those patients. And this is a video. It takes 10 seconds to scan the entire child. The parents, they go into that MRI with those children together. And then we can study stuff, for example, like swallowing, right? And I don't know whether you know pineapple is the positive contrast media in the MRI. And this is actually a child which had swallowing problems. And you can see where is the swallowing problem here without any contrast media, any radiation, right? So in real time, we can study how these children swallow. Or the speech therapist, unfortunately, we don't have the audio, but this child said crocodile, and he has a problem with the velum, which the ENT people fixed, right? But you can actually have those patients speak in the MRI and study what is the problem with their speech. Anastomotic stricture, we do these balloon dilations, and we always dilate or calibrate 4 weeks after the surgery. I know there's controversy about that, but we really want them not to be symptomatic and then dilate the stricture. We want to calibrate the stricture that they are ready when they start with solid foods. And we are very successful dilating a soft stricture in the beginning, and then the patient is ready. There are, however, patients like this patient who was referred after 76 dilations, and this was like 5 years ago. There was the reality still. There are those patients in Germany, and that's a stricture that's not fixable. And we did an open repair because there was just like a mess after all these operations. But now he can eat, and I think you have this. If you have that cornflakes test, you're kind of ready. And I just want to say there are patients where you cannot dilate a stricture anymore. This just like out of scope. ReTF, what should we look at? And we should look at maybe other options than redo surgery. There's this overlooked upper fistula once in a while that we see. There's recurrent fistula here in that pouch. And there's a new method. It's actually not so new, but we have been applying this method also. It's a very aggressive acid, which you do on a swab, and then you do a rigid tracheoscopy. And here you come from above, and here is the pouch. And you put the TCA actually in that upper pouch, and that destroys the mucosa. That's the whole idea about it. If you destroy the mucosa of the refistula, you close it, right? And then you leave it in there, and then after the procedure, it looks like this. It's a little scary, but after 3 months, it's closed. And there's a nice study actually from Sweden. From Jan, you were involved in that study also. They have 18 patients, and they have 9 out of 10 patients that are closed, right? And if you consider like what major surgery this is, if you do that open or thoracoscopically even, and you have an endoscopic solution here, and we have only little experience with 6 patients, and they all closed. So I think this is really nowadays, it should be the first choice if you have a refistula, to try that endoscopically. Respiratory problems. What should we look at? This is a word or a sentence everybody knows, but it's true also for EA, right? And it's just common sense that these children are too sick that one surgeon or one physician can treat them alone. We founded this EAT center. It's esophagus and upper airway treatment center. And this is all the 14 disciplines that are there. And sometimes we need the pneumonologist. We have EAT conferences where we discuss these patients. And we did a bronchial lavage in all the patients which we scoped, and we found actually there's a neutrophilic airway inflammation in a lot of these EATF patients, 21 were involved in there, which is comparable to severe bacterial bronchitis and primary ciliary dyskinesia. And we also found a lot of pathogens in that lavage which make these children sick. So there's a lot of things, if we don't look for them, and that's the title of the study, we don't find them. And this helps a lot of patients that we take advantage of the situation, anesthesia, then scope the child, lavage the child, and get the information. Sometimes with the other disciplines, we don't look the same way on the patient, but it's also very important to have the different views on the patients to then come up with a solution. For example, if a child needs an anti-reflux surgery or should continue on PPI, this should be a group discussion in the EAT center, right? Should not be like an outpatient visit with one physician and then, okay, let's give that child a fundo, right? This is not how it should work. It should be a group effort to come with the best solution. Growth and development issues, sometimes we need the gastroenterologist in that. And we also should look at the acquired anomalies. You know, there's a lot of controversy, thoracoscopy or open repair. Everybody knows that thoracotomy is a major impact. And the funny thing is, if we look at the outcome, two main complications, the major complication, there's no difference. Stricture rate is the same, leakage rate is the same. So why should we care about thoracoscopic repair of TF? And the reason is, there is a significant musculoskeletal morbidity going with it. And we looked at that, scoliosis, winged scapula, chest deformities, fused ribs. Also, not only a long-term study, this is a study I did a couple of years ago showing that they all have scoliosis, winged scapula, a lot of problems. And if you look at them in clinic, right, and you need to have them bend over and elevate their arms, then you see there's the winged scapula. For instance, this girl here, if you don't have her made these maneuvers, these are the things you have to look at, then you know there's the winged scapula. And with the real-time MRI, we saw the fused ribs. We can look at the scoliosis, and in real time, we assessed over 50 older patients with TF and EA, and we saw actually that the thoracic volume on the right side is smaller. The thoracic volume on the right side in expiration is smaller, and the lung volume also. And here, if you look at in real time, this is a patient undergoing thoracoscopy with a normal movement of the right and left chest. This is a patient with an open rib repair where the right side actually does barely move. And here you see also another patient who underwent esophageal atresia repair. He has a rib fusion here, and the right chest does actually not move. The left chest moves, right? But the right chest not. And these are things we need to look at. Psychosocial aspects in the long term, not only this age, but also this age. We have psychiatrists involved, and 1 week ago we had a webinar on it, on the psychiatry meets pediatric surgery. There's a QR code here. We had a discussion on all these issues. So what is the future? I don't know whether you appreciated this paper. It's from China. It's a 3-center study, and they actually did a robotic repair on over 70 of these babies, right? And we also started a robotic program in Leipzig a few years ago. These are 8mm instruments, but what is really important, they are bigger instruments, but you need the big instrument to really be able to move them in small spaces. So maybe the future will be the robotic repair with the Da Vinci we have right now on TF patients. So, and the future is there now already, and the Chinese have really made this serious, and it's very, very impressive. So, closing this talk, if you don't look, you don't see, but sometimes you need 2 eyes, sometimes you need more than 2 eyes, and sometimes you need a lot of eyes to help these children with EA, but it should not be the surgeon who is like in the center and everything is around the surgeon. It should be the patient and the family. And we, as all the disciplines, need to maneuver ourselves around that patient. We have a paper on the long-term morbidity in German for those who are interested. I thank you very much.